And joining us here on 6 p.m. Prime on India Today is the Executive Director of the Indian Century Roundtable, Professor Salvatore Babones, who's gained fame, of course, here in India for busting a narrative that's set, particularly with regards to global rating agencies and how they view India. Professor Babones, thank you very much for joining us here on India Today. I'll just begin, first of all, by asking you direct your view on what former US President Mr. Barack Obama has said. I'll just quote what he said. He said, if you do not protect the rights of ethnic minorities in India and religious minorities, there's a strong possibility that India starts pulling apart. Your view, Professor?
I'm sorry to be the one to tell Indian audiences, but unfortunately, Barack Obama is simply reflecting the Washington elite consensus view in the United States. And you can see that if you just read the Washington Post, the New York Times, even the Wall Street Journal, or if you see what's coming out of the U.S. State Department on India. I don't really blame Barack Obama, who's, after all, not an India expert, for simply reflecting the view of the American establishment on India.
That's something, Mr. Babones, you've spoken about repeatedly. You've shown the spotlight on. But I do kind of differ from you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I find it hard to believe that a former US president relies on this kind of a narrative or on publications. Surely he's got his facts.
Well, he's getting his facts from his own intelligence briefings, and his intelligence briefings are pulling together this information. Look, I'm sorry to be the one to report this, but I've talked to a lot of senior academics, senior think tankers, and even some senior government officials in the United States. And they all share, almost all of them share this same view of India. Now, it's not a fact-based view at all. It's a view based on the op-eds and editorials they see. It's a view based on the rhetoric coming out of NGOs in the United States. But, keep this in mind. The United States Holocaust Museum, which is the most respected American institution when it comes to genocide, and everyone in the United States respects the U.S. Holocaust Museum, well, they're the ones saying that there is a strong possibility of a Muslim genocide in India in the 2020s. So when the United States Holocaust Museum is saying that, why should you expect Barack Obama, who after all is a generalist, he's a retired politician, he's not an India expert, why would you expect him to know better than these so-called experts in the United States? He's getting his views from the experts in the United States. It's the experts who have it wrong, not the politicians.
But Mr. Babones, that really is the concern. You're referring to one instance of an American body suggesting that there could be a genocide in India. Can America, can these American organizations, can Mr. Barack Obama really afford to preach to India given America's track record?
Everyone has a right to preach about human rights, and that includes even countries that have poor records on human rights, as I'm sad to say my own country often does. I am, of course, American, even though I live and work in Australia. The United States has done many terrible things, but that doesn't mean that we as humans should not care about human rights. But the problem is not that America cares about human rights. Of course, we want America to care about human rights. The problem is that America is woefully misinformed on the situation in India. They don't even read their own survey research. We have excellent, high-quality American survey research coming out of the Pew Research Center, the world's most respected survey research organization, about the status of Muslims in India. And the Pew Research Center's surveys show that Muslims in general report very low levels of discrimination in India. 98% say they're free to practice their religion in India. 99%, and I always remind Indian audiences of this, 99% of Indian Muslims say they're proud to be Indian. This problem does not arise from India's Muslims. This problem arises from international Islamists and international NGOs attempting to weaponize Indian Muslims for their own benefit.
Mr. Babones, in such a circumstance, where does this kind of a narrative about India really stem from? Yes, there are publications that talk about India a certain way, but where does it emerge from? What is the source? Because very often, and this is something India has highlighted time and again, that our diversity is our strength. Do many countries just fail to understand that?
They don't understand it because their views are mediated by the experts and the press. And unfortunately, Many of the experts are bought out by Pakistan and China, and much of the press is bought out by China. Now, I don't mean that in the extremist view of China pays for everything and they just do what China says. I mean that in the tilting the playing field sense, that China and its proxies in Pakistan and Pakistan's proxies in the Gulf states, they tilt the playing field consistently but constantly against India, promoting a narrative of repression of Muslims in India. It is incessant, and once you start looking for it, you can find it everywhere. I mean, for example, the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom is, of course, an American Muslim. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Americans are of all creeds. However, when he highlighted the last year, the International Religious Freedom report from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, the only thing he highlighted about India was the status of Muslims. Now, keep that in mind. When the USCIRF and the data underlying it from the State Department are overwhelmingly dominated by complaints made by Christians in India. Now, I don't want to take sides. Are Christians persecuted or Muslims persecuted? All of our data suggests that neither are persecuted in India. However, the reports in the data show that all these complaints come from Christians. Why is the Muslim American Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom only concerned about the status of Muslims in India? Because, frankly, it's very likely that he was appointed because of a Muslim American political lobbying and political contributions. These are all highly political positions, minor ambassadorships, and they're getting what they wanted. They paid for and got a State Department view on Muslims in India. Now, India, being a democracy, doesn't play this game. And I don't advocate that India do play this game, but Indians have to understand that they're up against a totalitarian regime in China, an authoritarian regime in Pakistan, a series of authoritarian regimes in the Persian Gulf, who are fundamentally unfriendly to, if I can be frank, Hindu-majority India.
You made a very interesting point there, Professor Babonas, on the China factor in kind of, spreading this misinformation on the image of India. But I also want to, when I wrap this up, Professor Babonas, ask you, what's your view on all of this, considering that you're someone who's researched greatly into India, you've spoken in great detail about how these global rating agencies also view India, you've met with the Prime Minister in several occasions. Do you believe any of this narrative? You've been to India as well. Do you think that there is any truth at all to this narrative of Muslim rights being trampled in the country?
I'm an academic social scientist. I never base my views on personal experiences. I always go to the data. We have excellent social survey data on India. We also have a lot of circumstantial evidence on things like first indication reports for sedition, on things like crimes against journalists in India. We have complaints that are filed with the U.S. International Religious Freedom Report says. We have other data as well. The data simply don't support the argument that any religious minority in India faces systematic persecution. Now, of course, there is discrimination on a low level against people in India, just as there is in any other country. But it's at a low level. I want to stress that. The same survey that shows 24% of Muslims believe that Muslims face discrimination in India shows that 80% of African Americans face discrimination in the United States. Over 40% of Asian Americans face discrimination in the United States. And again, that's the same survey conducted by the same research organization. They're directly comparable figures. So when I evaluate India, I go to the data, and I think the data are very clear. India is a successful liberal democracy that, obviously there are violations of human rights. Every time a reporter tells me that such and such's rights have been violated, I say it's very good of you to report it. You should make it very public, and hopefully it'll be addressed. The difference between India and other countries is that in India, almost alone among developing countries, those human rights violations do get addressed. There is a robust court system. People do pay the penalty when they transgress on others' rights. It may take time, it may not be as efficient as we'd like, but it gets done. And that's not something you can say about just about any other country in India's income bracket.
So every country has issues, so does India, but you're saying, Professor Babonas, that India is one of the few countries that has a very, very robust mechanism in place to address that. So interesting perspective there. Thank you very much as always. It's a pleasure to have you here with us on India Today.